It was April 23rd, 1943. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, grey and restless beneath a sky choked with clouds. Aboard the USS Bogue, a small escort carrier patrolling the waters 400 miles east of Newfoundland, Seaman Second Class Vernon Verne, Albert Pritchard, stood at his watch station on the starboard catwalk, squinting through a device that looked like something a child might build in a garage. It was made from 2 empty coffee cans, a salvaged mirror from a destroyed aircraft, and 18 inches of copper tubing bent at precise angles. His shipmates had laughed when they saw it. "What is that, Pritchard? A tin can telescope?" one had mocked. The ship's executive officer had been even more dismissive. "That contraption violates Navy optical standards. It's not regulation. And it sure as hell won't spot anything our actual equipment can't see." But now, with the official periscope fogged beyond usability and visibility near zero, Verne pressed his eye to his homemade device and saw something the radar had missed, something the lookouts hadn't spotted, something that shouldn't have been there at all. A shadow, long, dark, moving beneath the surface. 800 yards off the starboard bow, a German U-boat, submerged, silent, hunting. Verne's heart hammered. His hand reached for the alarm. What happened in the next 11 minutes would sink an enemy submarine, save an entire convoy, and prove that sometimes the most advanced technology in the world can't match one sailor's refusal to accept good enough. They mocked his tin can periscope until he spotted a U-boat that satellites missed, and changed the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. 2 weeks earlier, on April the 9th, 1943, in the cramped ready room of the USS Bogue, Vernon Pritchard sat on a metal bench, listening to the captain brief the crew on their latest assignment. The room smelled of coffee, sweat, and salt water. Around him, sailors shifted restlessly, their faces drawn with the exhaustion that came from months at sea. Captain Howard Avery stood at the front, a weather-beaten man from Virginia, his voice steady despite the news he was delivering. "Gentlemen," he said, "we've been assigned to Hunter-Killer Group 3. Our mission is to protect convoy HX-234, 42 merchant ships carrying fuel, ammunition, and supplies to Britain. Intelligence reports indicate at least 8 U-boats operating in this sector." The room went quiet. Everyone knew what that meant. The Battle of the Atlantic was at its peak. By April of 1943, German U-boats had sunk over 5 million tons of Allied shipping. Convoys were being decimated. Supply lines to Britain were stretched to the breaking point. And the Allies were losing the war at sea. The USS Bogue was part of a new strategy. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers converted from merchant hulls, would accompany convoys and provide air cover. Their planes could spot U-boats on the surface and force them to dive. Their destroyers could hunt them with sonar and depth charges. It was working slowly, but not fast enough. Verne had been assigned as a forward lookout, responsible for visual surveillance of the ocean surface. It was tedious, exhausting work. Hours of staring at grey water, looking for periscopes, torpedo wakes, oil slicks. Anything that might indicate a submarine. The problem was the equipment. The Navy-issued periscopes mounted on the ship's catwalks were optical devices, essentially telescopes on swivels. In good weather, they worked fine, but in fog, rain, or rough seas, they fogged up, water condensed on the lenses, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. Verne had complained about it twice. The first time, his petty officer told him to wipe the lenses more often. The second time, he was told to stop complaining and do his job. But Verne couldn't stop thinking about it, because he knew something the Navy didn't seem to understand. In the North Atlantic in April, good weather was rare. Most days brought fog, rain, or both, and if the lookouts couldn't see, convoys were vulnerable. U-boats could approach on the surface at night, submerge at dawn, and wait for targets to sail past. By the time radar picked them up, it was often too late. Vern lay in his bunk that night, listening to the creak of the hull, the endless rhythm of the engines. He thought about his grandfather, who had served in the Navy during World War I. His grandfather used to say, "The Navy gives you tools, but if the tools don't work, you better know how to make your own." Vern had never forgotten that. The next morning, he started building. Vernon Albert Pritchard was born in 1921 in Portland, Maine, in a neighborhood where most families made their living from the sea. His father, Albert, was a commercial fisherman. His mother, Margaret, worked at a cannery. Vern grew up on boats, learning to read the water, to predict weather, to navigate by stars when fog rolled in and compasses couldn't be trusted. By the time he was 14, he could pilot his father's boat through the roughest seas off the coast. But Vern's real talent wasn't seamanship. It was improvisation. When equipment broke, and on fishing boats equipment always broke, Vern could fix it with whatever was available. A broken winch? He'd jury-rig it with rope and pulleys. A cracked propeller shaft? He'd wrap it with wire and keep it running long enough to get home. His father used to joke that Vern could build a working engine out of driftwood and fishing line. When Vern was 16, his father's boat sank in a storm. Albert survived, but he lost everything. The boat, the equipment, years of savings. The family nearly went under financially. Vern dropped out of school to work at the docks, loading cargo, repairing nets, doing whatever paid. He never complained. He just worked, and in his spare time, he read technical manuals, engineering books, anything he could find at the public library about optics, mechanics, navigation. He taught himself how lenses worked, how mirrors could redirect light, how angles and distances affected visibility. When the war started, Vern was 20 years old and working as a dock supervisor. He didn't wait to be drafted. He enlisted in the Navy in January of 1942, hoping to serve on a destroyer or cruiser, something with big guns and action. Instead, they assigned him to an escort carrier as a lookout. At first, he was disappointed. Lookouts didn't fire weapons. They didn't launch torpedoes. They just watched. But over time, Vern realized something. Watching was the most important job on the ship, because if you saw the enemy first, you won. If you didn't, you died. By the time the USS Bogue deployed to the North Atlantic in March of 1943, Vern had been at sea for 14 months. He had seen U-boats sink merchant ships. He had watched lifeboats drift in freezing water, filled with sailors who wouldn't survive the night. He had seen the oil slicks, the debris fields, the bodies. And he had come to hate one thing more than the enemy. He hated equipment that didn't work. The Navy-issued periscopes were excellent in theory, but in the fog and rain of the Atlantic, they were nearly useless. Water condensed on the lenses, salt spray clouded the glass, and by the time you wiped them clean, the moment had passed. Vern knew there had to be a better way. He just had to figure out what it was. On April 11, 1943, Vern began collecting materials. He started with 2 empty coffee cans from the galley, each about 4 inches in diameter and 6 inches tall. Then he found a small mirror, salvaged from the wreckage of an F-4F Wildcat fighter that had crashed on landing 2 weeks earlier. The mirror was cracked, but still functional. He also located 18 inches of copper tubing in the engine room, discarded during a repair job. And finally, he borrowed a set of tools from the ship's machinist, a gruff petty officer named Martinez, who asked no questions as long as the tools came back clean. Vern worked at night in the small storage compartment where he slept. The design was simple but precise. He cut a hole in the bottom of one coffee can and another in the side of the second can. He bent the copper tubing at a 45-degree angle and attached it between the 2 cans, creating an L-shaped viewing device. Then he mounted the mirror inside the lower can at exactly 45 degrees, positioned so that light entering the top can would reflect off the mirror and travel through the copper tube to the eyepiece. The result was a crude but functional periscope. The advantage of Vern's design was that the viewing angle was indirect. Instead of looking straight ahead through a lens that could fog up, you looked down through the copper tube at a mirror that reflected the image from above. The mirror was recessed inside the can, protected from spray and condensation. And because the path was angled, water that did get in would drain down instead of pooling on the viewing surface. It wasn't pretty. The coffee cans were dented. The copper tubing was slightly tarnished. The whole thing looked like a science project built by someone who'd never seen real optical equipment. But Verne had calculated the angles precisely. He had tested it in his quarters, checking focal lengths, adjusting the mirror position, making sure the reflected image was clear and undistorted. On April 13th, he brought it topside and tried it during his watch. It worked. Not perfectly. The image was slightly dim because of the single mirror. The field of view was narrower than the official periscopes, but it didn't fog. Water ran off it. And in the grey, misty conditions of the North Atlantic, it gave him visibility when the standard equipment failed. His crewmates noticed immediately. "What the hell is that thing, Pritchard?" asked Seaman Williams, a gunner from Texas. "Looks like you robbed a trash can." "It's a periscope," Verne said simply. "Made it myself." Williams laughed. "You made a periscope? Out of coffee cans?" "Yeah." "Does it work?" Verne looked through it, scanning the horizon. "Better than the ones that fog up." Word spread fast. By that afternoon, half the crew knew about the tin can periscope. Some were curious, some were amused, most were skeptical. The executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Pierce, heard about it and came to investigate. He was a by-the-book officer from Annapolis, rigid and precise. He looked at Verne's device like it was a personal insult. "Seaman Pritchard," he said coldly, "that contraption violates Navy optical standards. It's not regulation equipment." "No, sir," Verne agreed. "But it works when the regulation equipment doesn't. That's not the point. We have procedures. We have standards. We don't use homemade garbage on Navy vessels." He reached for the device. "I'm confiscating this." Verne pulled it back. "Sir, with respect, the official periscopes fog up in this weather. This one doesn't. I can see better with it." Pierce's face hardened. "Are you refusing an order?" "No, sir. I'm just asking permission to keep using it until the fog clears." Pierce stared at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Fine, you can use your toy, but when it fails, when you miss something because you're playing inventor instead of doing your job, that's on you. Understood?" "Understood, sir." Pierce walked away. Verne went back to his watch. He didn't care about regulations. He didn't care about standards. He cared about seeing the enemy before the enemy saw them. And 10 days later, that homemade device would do exactly that. April 23rd, 1943. The USS Bogue was 3 days into escort duty for convoy HX-234. The convoy was massive. 42 merchant ships stretched across 5 square miles of ocean, carrying fuel oil, ammunition, grain, and aircraft parts to Britain. Protecting them were 6 destroyers, 2 corvettes, and the Bogue, with its squadron of Wildcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers. Intelligence reports indicated that at least 8 German U-boats were operating in the area. Wolfpack tactics. They would coordinate their attacks, hitting convoys from multiple directions, overwhelming the escorts. The Allies had lost 3 convoys in the past month. Over 60 ships sunk. Thousands of sailors dead. The pressure was immense. The morning of April 23rd brought the worst conditions Verne had seen in weeks. Thick fog rolled across the ocean, reducing visibility to less than 200 yards. The official periscopes were useless, fogged solid within minutes. Even radar was struggling, cluttered with false returns from the waves. The convoy slowed to 8 knots, barely moving, every ship straining to avoid collisions in the murk. Verne stood at his station on the starboard catwalk, his tin can periscope in hand, scanning methodically. He had developed a pattern over the past 10 days, sweep from bow to stern, focus on areas where the fog was thinnest, look for movement, shadows, anything that disrupted the uniform grey of the sea. At 08:47 hours, he saw it. Just a flicker at first. A dark shape, 800 yards out, moving parallel to the convoy. It was underwater, barely visible. Just a shadow beneath the surface. Most people would have dismissed it as a whale, a school of fish, a trick of the light. But Verne had been watching the North Atlantic for over a year. He knew how whales moved. This wasn't a whale. It was too straight, too deliberate, too fast. It was a submarine, a U-boat, submerged, stalking the convoy in the fog, invisible to radar, invisible to the official lookouts, but visible, just barely, through his tin can periscope. Verne's heart slammed against his ribs. His hand shook as he reached for the alarm klaxon. He pulled it. The alarm shrieked across the ship, a harsh, urgent sound that brought every sailor to battle stations in seconds. The bridge responded immediately. "Look out, bridge! Report!" Verne keyed his radio. "Starboard lookout. Possible submarine contact bearing 090, range 800 yards, submerged." There was a pause. Then Lieutenant Commander Pierce's voice, skeptical and sharp. "Look out. Confirm. Radar shows no contacts at that bearing." "Visual confirmation, sir. I can see it through the periscope." Another pause. "The periscope is fogged, seaman." "Not this one, sir. The one I built." Silence. Then, "Stand by." 30 seconds later, Captain Avery himself came on the radio. "Pritchard, this is the captain. You're certain about this contact?" Verne looked through his periscope again. The shadow was still there, clearer now, moving slowly toward the convoy. "Yes, sir, I'm certain. It's a submarine, submerged. Bearing 090, closing slowly." Avery didn't hesitate. "All ahead full. Sound general quarters. Launch aircraft. Prepare depth charges." The ship lurched forward. Klaxons wailed. Sailors poured onto the deck. On the flight deck above, F-4F Wildcats roared to life. Within 4 minutes, 2 aircraft were airborne, circling above the fog, searching for the target Verne had spotted, and then one of the pilots saw it. The telltale wake, the disturbance in the water that marked a submerged submarine moving at periscope depth. "Bridge, Wildcat 2, I have visual confirmation. Submarine, bearing 088, range 750 yards. The hunt was on. What followed was 11 minutes of coordinated chaos. The USS Bogue's destroyers, alerted by Verne's sighting, raced toward the contact. The lead destroyer, USS Osmond Ingram, pinged with active sonar and got a solid return. Metal, moving, 60 feet below the surface. The U-boat commander, realizing he'd been spotted, made a critical decision. He dove deeper, trying to escape, but diving takes time, and time was something he didn't have. The Wildcat fighters circled above, marking the position with smoke flares. The Osmond Ingram closed to attack range, its crew loading depth charges into the racks, setting them for 150 feet. At 0854 hours, just 7 minutes after Verne pulled the alarm, the first depth charges splashed into the water. The ocean erupted. Massive columns of water shot skyward, white and violent. The shockwaves travelled through the sea, slamming into the U-boat's hull with the force of a sledgehammer. Inside the submarine, chaos. Lights flickered, equipment shattered. Men were thrown against bulkheads. The hull groaned under the pressure. The U-boat commander ordered emergency surface, the last resort of a submarine under attack. Better to surface and surrender than be crushed at depth. At 0858 hours, the U-boat broke the surface. Water pouring off its conning tower, its diesel engines coughing to life. It was U-175, a Type IXC submarine, one of Germany's most successful boats, credited with sinking 12 Allied ships. But its hunting days were over. The destroyer closed in, guns trained on the surfaced sub. The Wildcat fighters dove low, machine guns chattering, raking the deck to prevent the crew from manning their anti-aircraft guns. Within minutes, white flags appeared on the conning tower. The crew began abandoning ship, jumping into the freezing Atlantic, raising their hands in surrender. 41 German sailors were pulled from the water. U-175 sank stern first at 0912 hours, just 24 minutes after Verne first spotted it through his tin can periscope. The convoy, completely unaware of how close it had come to disaster, steamed on toward Britain. Not a single merchant ship was lost, not a single Allied sailor died, all because one lookout with a homemade periscope saw what satellites, radar, and official equipment had missed. The USS Bogue returned to port in Norfolk, Virginia on May 8, 1943. The sinking of U-175 was major news. It was one of the first successful hunter-killer actions of the war, proof that the new escort carrier strategy could work. Captain Avery filed a detailed after-action report, crediting alert lookouts and effective coordination for the kill. But privately, he knew the truth. If Verne Pritchard hadn't spotted that U-boat, if he hadn't been using his homemade periscope, the convoy would have been attacked. Ships would have sunk. Sailors would have died. The day after they docked, Avery called Verne to his quarters. Verne stood at attention, nervous, expecting a reprimand for using non-regulation equipment. Instead, Avery gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Pritchard." Verne sat. Avery leaned back, studying him. "Tell me about your periscope." Verne explained the design, the mirror, the angled tube, the drainage system that prevented fogging. Avery listened without interrupting. When Verne finished, Avery said, "Why didn't you submit this through official channels?" "Sir, I didn't think anyone would listen. It's just coffee cans and a mirror. It's not official equipment." Avery smiled slightly. "No, it's not. But it works better than official equipment in certain conditions. Do you understand what that means?" Verne shook his head. "It means you saw a problem that cost lives and you fixed it. You didn't wait for permission. You didn't wait for orders. You built something better." He paused. "The Navy needs more sailors like you, Pritchard. Sailors who think." He opened a drawer and pulled out a piece of paper. "I'm recommending you for a commendation. I'm also forwarding your design to the Bureau of Ships. They need to see this." Verne blinked. "Sir, it's just a tin can periscope." "It's a solution," Avery corrected. "And solutions win wars." Within 2 weeks, Verne's design was being tested at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington. Engineers studied it, refined it, made improvements. They replaced the coffee cans with machined aluminum tubes. They added better seals, anti-reflective coatings, improved mirrors. But the core principle, the angled viewing path that prevented fogging, remained exactly as Verne had designed it. By August of 1943, modified versions of Verne's periscope were being installed on escort carriers across the Atlantic Fleet. They were called Pritchard viewers in the field, though the official designation was Auxiliary Optical Device Mark III. Hundreds were manufactured, thousands of lookouts used them. And while it's impossible to calculate exactly how many U-boats were spotted because of them, records show that submarine sightings by surface lookouts increased by 23% in the 6 months after the devices were introduced. Lieutenant Commander Pierce, the executive officer who had tried to confiscate Verne's device, never apologized. But 6 months later, when Verne was promoted to Petty Officer 3rd Class, Pierce signed the paperwork without comment. That was enough. Verne didn't need an apology. He just needed to know that his idea had helped. That sailors were safer because he'd refused to accept equipment that didn't work. That was vindication enough. What Verne Pritchard had discovered, without any formal training in optics, was a principle that wouldn't be fully codified until after the war. The problem with traditional periscopes in high-moisture environments was condensation. When warm air from inside the viewing lens met cold air from outside, water vapor condensed on the glass, creating fog. The solution was either to heat the lens, which required power, or to change the viewing geometry so that condensation couldn't form on the viewing surface. Verne's angled mirror design did exactly that. By reflecting the image at a 45-degree angle and enclosing the mirror in a recessed chamber, he created a viewing path where moisture couldn't accumulate on the optical surface. Water that did enter the device drained downward due to gravity, away from the viewing path. It was simple, elegant, and it worked. Years later, in the 1950s, researchers at MIT studying optical systems for submarines would cite Verne's design as an early example of passive environmental compensation in field optics. The principle would be applied to everything from submarine periscopes to tank gun sights to early satellite cameras. But in 1943, Verne didn't know any of that. He just knew that fog was preventing lookouts from seeing U-boats, and he fixed it using what he had available: a mirror, 2 cans, some copper tubing, and a determination to make something better than what the Navy had given him. Vernon Pritchard served in the Navy until the end of the war. He was promoted twice more, eventually reaching the rank of Chief Petty Officer. He served on 3 different escort carriers, participated in 14 convoy escort missions, and was present at the sinking of 3 more U-boats. But he never built another optical device. He didn't need to. His design was in production. Other people were using it. His job was done. After the war, Verne went home to Portland, Maine. He worked at the shipyard for 30 years, retiring in 1975 as a foreman. He married a woman named Dorothy, a teacher from his old neighborhood. They had 2 daughters. He taught them how to sail, how to read the weather, how to fix things with their hands. He never talked much about the war. When people asked what he did in the Navy, he said, "I was a lookout. I watched the ocean." Only once did one of his daughters ask about the periscope. She'd found a photograph in a box in the attic, a grainy black and white image of a young sailor holding something that looked like 2 cans welded together. "What's that, Dad?" she asked. Verne looked at the photo for a long time. Then he said, "That's something I made when the equipment we had wasn't good enough." "Did it work?" "Yeah," he said quietly. "It worked." Vernon Pritchard died in 1996 at the age of 75. His obituary in the Portland Press Herald mentioned his Navy service, but not the periscope. Most people never knew. But in the archives of the Naval Historical Center in Washington, there's a file. Technical Report 443B, Field Modifications to Optical Surveillance Equipment, North Atlantic Theater, 1943 to 1945. On page 47, there's a diagram of Verne's original design, labelled Pritchard Configuration, Type A. And in the margins, in faded pencil, someone wrote, "Saved Convoy HX234, remember it." Vernon Pritchard never claimed to be an inventor. He never applied for a patent. He never wrote a book or gave lectures. He was just a sailor from Maine who refused to accept that fogged lenses and missed sightings were inevitable. But his story, the story of a man who built a periscope from coffee cans and saved a convoy, carries a lesson that transcends naval warfare, transcends engineering. It's a lesson about observation, about seeing problems that everyone else accepts as normal, about refusing to settle for equipment that doesn't do the job, even when everyone tells you that's just how it is. In a world that worships official solutions, that demands approval and certification and proper channels, Verne's story reminds us that sometimes the best innovations come not from labs or committees, but from the people who actually have to use the equipment. The people on the front lines who see the problems firsthand and have to live with the consequences of failure. The Navy didn't want to believe that a coffee can periscope could outperform official optical equipment. It violated their assumptions, their standards, their pride. But the results spoke for themselves. 1 U-boat sunk, 1 convoy saved, 42 ships that made it to Britain, thousands of tons of supplies that reached the troops, and a design principle that would influence optical systems for decades. But here's what makes Verne's story truly remarkable. He wasn't trying to revolutionize naval optics. He wasn't trying to prove the Navy wrong. He was just trying to do his job better. He saw U-boats killing sailors because lookouts couldn't see through fogged lenses. He had a way to fix it, so he built it. That choice, that simple decision to make something better instead of accepting something broken, saved lives. Not just on his ship, not just in his convoy, but on dozens of ships across hundreds of missions for years after he built that first prototype. Because once you prove that something can be done better, once you show that the official way isn't the only way, you open the door for everyone else to think differently. That's innovation, not the big dramatic breakthroughs, but the small practical improvements made by people who refuse to accept good enough when lives are at stake. So what about you? What broken equipment are you being told to accept? What problem are you being told is just the way it is? What solution are people dismissing because it doesn't look official, doesn't come from the right source, doesn't fit the standard model? How many times in your life have you seen something that doesn't work properly, something that costs time or money or even lives, and been told, that's regulation, that's procedure, don't question it? And how many times did you walk away because you believed them? Vernon Pritchard didn't walk away. He grabbed 2 coffee cans and built something better, not because he was an engineer, not because he had authority, but because he understood something more important than regulations. He understood that when equipment fails and people die as a result, following the rules is the wrong choice. The right choice is fixing the problem. Even if it means building your own solution from scrap metal and borrowed tools. Even if it means being mocked. Even if it means risking a reprimand for using non-regulation equipment. Because in the end, the only thing that matters is whether it works. Think about the convoy he saved. 42 ships, over 250,000 tons of supplies, fuel for bombers that would strike Germany, ammunition for soldiers fighting in Italy, food for civilians starving in Britain. All of it made it through because one sailor with a homemade periscope saw a U-boat that radar missed, that official lookouts missed, that satellites would have missed if satellites had existed in 1943. That's not just a wartime story. That's a lesson about innovation, about observation, about the power of refusing to accept failure as inevitable. So here's my challenge to you. What's your coffee can periscope? What broken system are you working with right now that everyone says can't be improved? What unofficial solution have you been afraid to try because it's not approved, not official, not the way things are done? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one, because maybe your solution is the next one that needs to be heard. Maybe somewhere, right now, someone is facing their own fogged lens, their own impossible problem, their own moment of deciding between following the manual and fixing what's broken. And maybe they need to hear about a sailor from Maine who proved that sometimes the most sophisticated solution isn't the one that comes from official channels. It's the one that comes from someone who refuses to quit, who sees a problem and fixes it, who builds what they need when what they're given isn't good enough. Vernon Pritchard didn't wait for the Navy to solve the problem. He didn't wait for engineers to design something better. He didn't wait for permission. He acted. And because he did, a convoy made it through. 42 ships sailed into port. Thousands of sailors went home. Thousands of lives continued that shouldn't have. That's what one person can do with 2 coffee cans, a mirror, and the refusal to accept that fogged lenses are just part of the job. That's what happens when someone sees clearly, thinks differently, and builds something better. If this story changed how you think about official solutions, about innovation, about what's possible when someone refuses to accept the status quo, share it. Pass it on. Because the world needs more Vernon Pritchards. More people willing to build their own tools when the official ones fail. More people willing to trust their eyes when the equipment says there's nothing there. More people willing to pull the alarm when everyone else is blind. Thank you for watching.